If you don't believe in aliens, this video might change your mind. In the early 2000s, a young boy named William was playing in his backyard when he started to hear a strange humming noise. Being curious, he went to investigate farther and suddenly came across an extremely bright light he later described as a color he had never seen before. He was terrified, but kept going closer and suddenly saw it. On the ground in front of him was a tiny alien, no bigger than a grasshopper or praying mantis. The boy said the alien looked up at him, surprised, and then disappeared into a beam of light that went far up into the sky. Do you think he was telling the truth? This is why everyone is afraid of dolls. In 1948, Jonathan Parker woke up after midnight to find something staring at him in his bed. It was a doll with red hair and bright eyes, and as if that wasn't enough, it had a note on it. At first, Jonathan thought his brothers were just playing a trick on him, but as he glanced over at their beds, he noticed they were still sound asleep. Jonathan grabbed his reading glasses and read the note. It said, "Miss me?" ? It was then that Jonathan noticed there was something even more frightening directly behind the doll, a creature with sharp teeth and glaring red eyes. He screamed, but when his family awoke, the doll and the creature were gone. There was one piece of evidence, though, that he still has to this day: the note. If you're afraid to fly, don't watch this video. James was flying for the first time at night when he noticed a strange person sitting across the aisle from him. The man was sweating and seemed to be changing somehow. His eyes were turning black, and his teeth seemed to be growing larger. The more the man changed, the worse the turbulence during the flight got. James warned the other passengers, who got together and tied the man to the seat. The vampire was too powerful, however, ripping open the emergency exit, opening his wings, and flying off into the night. The plane barely landed safely, but James never flew again. This is why you should never go to McDonald's at midnight. 1 month ago, 2 young girls were out late at night and looking for something to eat. They came across what looked like a brand new McDonald's, and they were about to open the door when they saw a terrifying person dressed in a McDonald's uniform with a large red wig waving slowly from the other side of the door. The girls later said that he had white eyes and almost didn't look human. They ran home and were so afraid that they called the police. The police checked the area and then went to the girls' home, informing them that the McDonald's they said was open had been burned to the ground 5 years ago, and the building was nothing but ashes. This is why you should never date a vampire. Ethan had met a girl online named Susan, and they had agreed to meet at the beach to get coffee together and go for a walk. He thought it was strange she wanted to meet after dark, but he didn't think too much of it. When he got to the beach after dark and saw Susan, he found she was beautiful, until her eyes turned a bright yellow and her mouth opened to reveal many razor-sharp teeth. She tried to bite his neck, but he luckily was wearing a cross that his grandmother had given him. She screamed when she saw it, flying off into the night. Ethan has never gone on a date since, and now he thinks every woman is a vampire. This is why you should never go to McDonald's at midnight. 1 month ago, 2 young girls were out late at night and looking for something to eat. They came across what looked like a brand new McDonald's, and they were about to open the door when they saw a terrifying person dressed in a McDonald's uniform with a large red wig waving slowly from the other side of the door. The girls later said that he had white eyes and almost didn't look human. They ran home and were so afraid that they called the police. The police checked the area and then went to the girls' home, informing them that the McDonald's they said was open had been burned to the ground 5 years ago, and the building was nothing but ashes.
It's time for a new series, Unsolved Mysterious Police Cases, Part 1. In 2007, a girl was wandering a beach in British Columbia when she found a sneaker. When she opened the sock, she found a human foot inside. Since then, there have been a number of severed feet washing up on shore. In 2008, they were able to identify one of the owners of the feet as someone who was suicidal. This caused many to speculate that the owners of the feet were people jumping off bridges, committing suicide, but it still didn't explain why there weren't other body parts showing up on shore. but this is just a theory and people still can't figure out what exactly happened. Unsolved Police Cases, Part 2. This one is brand new. I saw it in the news today on October 15th. Basically, it says there's been a jetpack sighting twice in the last 2 months in LA, right above the airport. They've been reported by airline pilots who have seen this person flying through the air. Like, I know jetpacks are kind of a thing now, but still, it's kind of weird and crazy to think, who is this person flying over LA? Right now, it's a mystery about who it is. Unsolved Police Cases, Part 3. A man and a woman died one summer morning on the side of the road in South Carolina. The only witness reported hearing gunshots and a car driving down a dirt road. When they were found, they had no identification and they had multiple gunshot wounds each. No one knows who they are, and the theory is they were Europeans hitchhiking across America. All anyone really knows is that they were murdered, left by the side of the road, and their killer never caught. Unsolved Police Cases, Part 4. Just a few days ago in Utah, the Department of Public Safety was flying around counting bighorn sheep. The officers came across this 10-foot tall metal thing just buried deep within the rocks. In this picture here, you can see just how big the metal monolith is. Any idea what it could be? I'm guessing aliens. Definitely aliens. Since it's Black History Month, I thought it would be a good time to talk about courageous black police officers who reformed law enforcement from early on. The first 2 officers I want to talk about are Lieutenant Richard Arthur Jones and Officer Belvin Perry Sr. These 2 men were the first black police officers hired for the Orlando Police Department. They were pioneers who had to endure racism from not only civilians but their co-workers as well. They were hired in 1951, years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The department didn't issue them guns or radios, and all they had were nightsticks and handcuffs. They patrolled dangerous streets only on foot and had to rely on using their words to defuse situations, a skill a lot of police officers could use today. The pair were heroes who paved the way for more people of color to join law enforcement. For Black History Month, I'm featuring videos about black police officers who reformed law enforcement in their day. This is Part 2. Georgia Ann Robinson was the first black female police officer to work for LAPD. It is believed she was the first black female law enforcement officer in the country. She was first recruited as a volunteer and later hired on as a jail matron in 1919. She also worked as an investigator in homicide cases and created a women's shelter in LA. She was eventually blinded by an inmate during her service, but that didn't stop her. She kept working in the women's shelter and teamed up with the NAACP to fight against segregation in LA schools. She was another hero who paved the way for more people of color to enter into law enforcement service. For Black History Month, I'm featuring videos about black police officers who helped reform law enforcement. This is Part 3 featuring Bass Reeves. Reeves was a former slave who was freed during the Emancipation Proclamation. He was hired as a deputy U.S. Marshal to track down fugitives in Native American territory. That made him the first ever U.S. Marshal to be appointed west of the Mississippi. He became an expert detective and would consistently track down even the most hardest to find criminals. As a former slave, he was illiterate, but he memorized all his warrants and writs. He reportedly never arrested the wrong person in his 32 years of law enforcement service. He survived multiple gunfights and assassination attempts. He was another hero who paved the way for more people of color to enter law enforcement service. I've started getting scary stories from not just cops, but other first responders as well. So I'm starting a new series to go along with the scariest things police have seen, but I'm calling this one Scary First Responder Stories. Check out episode 1 posted right after this. Scary First Responder Stories, Episode 1. This story comes from a firefighter in Reeltown, Alabama. It was a foggy night when this firefighter responded to a single vehicle accident. The call came from a vehicle linked to the 911 call alert system. They searched the area but couldn't find the vehicle due to the fog. Suddenly, a woman dressed in a bright yellow shirt showed up out of the fog, standing in the middle of the road. The firefighters slammed on their brakes, stopped, and got out. She pointed them to where the car was off the roadway. There was a man trapped inside who was unconscious. The firefighters were able to get him out, rescue him, and save his life. However, they couldn't find the mystery woman. They spoke to the survivor about his experience, and he told them after he crashed, he saw his wife, who was deceased. She comforted him and told him she would go for help. The man said she wore a bright yellow shirt. Scary First Responder Stories, Part 2. This was sent to me by a paramedic. At around 3 a.m., her and her partner responded to a residence regarding a woman with chest pains. They showed up at her house and approached the door. Through the window, they could see a young woman sitting at a table with an elderly woman. Neither of them moved or said a word. The paramedics knocked on the door, and the young woman answered. She said she wasn't feeling well and went to sit back down at the table, but the older woman wasn't there. They asked her if anyone else was home, and she said no. She requested to go to the hospital and went upstairs to get some belongings. The paramedics tried to use their radios, but they wouldn't work. The woman immediately came back downstairs and she had a completely different demeanor. She refused care and told them they had to leave immediately. They left the house. As they drove away, they looked at the house again, and through the window they could see the elderly woman sitting back at the table with the young woman. Scary First Responder Stories, Part 3. This story was sent to me by a firefighter. He and his team used an abandoned church building for training. This is when firefighters intentionally set fire to something and train how to put it out. After the church was mostly burned down, the firefighters walked around the interior. One firefighter felt something touch his back. When he turned around, there was nothing behind him. They later came across a burnt bookshelf that was partially blocking a staircase leading to a basement they didn't initially know was there. They moved the bookshelf but were unable to go down because the building was starting to collapse. One firefighter yelled down to see how far the echo carried. Immediately after he yelled, a voice responded. All the firefighters heard a ghastly scream come from deep inside the basement. They left and never discussed it again. Scary First Responder Stories, Episode 4. This is a well-known story from Chicago. On April 18th, 1924, a firefighter named Frank Levy was washing a window at the fire station. He paused for a moment and put his hand on the glass. He told one of his coworkers he had the feeling he was going to die that day. At that moment, a call came in, and his crew responded to a fire that had broken out in an office building. While fighting the fire, a wall collapsed and tragically killed 8 firemen. Frank Levy was one of those men. The next day, one of the surviving firemen looked at the window Frank had been washing the day before. There was an unusual stain that appeared to be a handprint. No matter what they did to try to remove it, the handprint remained. They even had someone take a look at the fingerprints and confirm the handprint belonged to Frank. On April 18th, 1944, a careless paperboy threw a stack of newspapers through that window. The window shattered exactly 20 years after Frank's passing. Scary First Responder Stories, Episode 5. This story comes from the historic Fire Station 2 in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Carl Kane was promoted to fire chief in 1950. He and his family lived at the station for several years. Unfortunately, Chief Kane committed suicide in 1964. In the years following his death, strange occurrences have led the firefighters of Station 2 to believe it is haunted. There have been reports of doors opening, footsteps, writings on the wall, and sightings of a mysterious figure. One firefighter explained his encounter in 2000. He was in bed at around 2 a.m. He heard footsteps approach him from behind, between his bunk and the wall. At first he thought he slept through a call, but he looked over to his lieutenant, who was still asleep. The radio was also silent. He could hear and feel the presence of someone standing over him. He slowly turned to look at who it was, only to find no one there. Paranormal Hospital Stories. This story was sent by a hospital security officer in Northern California. One night he received a call from housekeeping staff who said they could see an elderly female patient in a hospital gown standing outside. By the time he arrived, she was gone. He went throughout the entire hospital with the description the housekeeping staff had given him. After talking to every department, no one recognized the patient. He also realized, according to the hospital records, there were no female patients in the hospital at that time. He looked at cameras and saw housekeeping looking and pointing in the direction where they said the patient was. But in the video, there was nothing there. Oddly enough, while housekeeping was looking at that area, a motion light suddenly turned on. This story will freak you out, especially if you are home alone. It was sent to me by a resident in an old house in Fishkill, New York. He was home alone one night when the rest of his family was out traveling. At about 10 p.m., he heard a loud crash come from the hallway. He checked to see what it was and saw a vase smashed on the ground. The vase was secured on a table to prevent it from falling, so it would take a lot of force to push it down. He started cleaning up the mess, and that's when something caught his eye. Down at the end of the hallway, in the shadows, he saw a dark figure about 10 to 15 feet from him. He ran out of the house and called the police. They responded immediately and checked the house, but found no one inside. He was certain someone had broken in, but all the doors and windows were locked and secured, and there was no sign of forced entry. The doors were even alarmed, and never went off. The creepy part is, the house even had some indoor cameras that covered parts of the house that didn't pick up any movement. At about 1 a.m., the police officers left, and he went to bed. But it wasn't over. Later on that night, he heard what sounded like someone walking outside of his bedroom. While in bed, he pulled out his phone and checked the camera app to see if he could find anything. He checked each camera, and the only thing that stood out was his German Shepherd in a bedroom downstairs. The dog was obviously upset, whining and whimpering. He went down to see what was wrong with the dog. When he got there, the dog was growling and barking like there was someone in the room. But it was completely empty except for him and the dog. He decided that was enough, and he called his cousins to spend the rest of the night with him. Good luck sleeping tonight. Paranormal Hospital Stories, Episode 1. This story was sent to me by a former ER tech in Corpus Christi, Texas. One night a few years ago at a hospital, she was walking back to her area after dropping off a patient. She saw an elderly man in a patient's gown standing by the elevator. She started asking him questions to see if he was okay and see if he was a patient on that floor. He just stared at her and didn't answer. She turned the corner and looked down the hallway to see if there was any staff nearby that could help her, but she didn't see anyone. She turned back to the elevator and the man was gone. She was worried about him, so she called security to help find him. While they were looking, the ER tech gave a description of the man to the nurses on that floor, and they didn't recognize him. The security guards invited her back to look at the surveillance video. In the video, the ER tech was standing at the elevator alone. She said in the video, it looked like she was talking to someone who wasn't there. I'm at Disneyland for the week, so I thought I'd give you guys paranormal Disneyland stories. This is part 1. It's common knowledge that Walt Disney had an apartment over the fire station on Main Street. There is a light in the window that is always left on as a tribute to Walt, who died in 1966. But before the tradition of leaving the light on began, a cast member was in charge of turning the light on and off. One evening, a cast member turned off the light and left the room. When she returned, she found the light turned on again. According to the story, she heard a voice that said, "I am still here." The light is now always turned on. Paranormal Disneyland Stories, Part 3. This is one of the more popular legends, with a backstory rooted in a true incident. The Matterhorn bobsleds opened in 1959. Several former cast members have written about their experiences when working the ride. One wrote about her end-of-the-day duties when she had to walk the track to look for lost items. Every time she walked the track, she had an uneasy feeling like she was being watched. The feeling got worse toward the middle of the ride in a large cavern known as Dolly's Dip. All the lights in that area seem to always be burned out. This spot is famous for a reason. In 1984, a woman nicknamed Dolly fell from her seat and was struck by an oncoming bobsled. She sadly died from the incident. Now, all unexplainable occurrences are said to be caused by her ghost. That is not the only incident, however. In 1964, a 15-year-old boy also died on the ride. The incident is notable as being the first documented death at Disneyland. Scary Stories Sent by You, Episode 1. I figured I'd start out the series with one of my own personal stories. When I was 16 years old, I cleaned buses for a charter bus company. I had to clean the buses whenever they got in, so it was usually late at night or early before school. The newest bus in the fleet had just been purchased. The rumor was it was cheap because it had hit and killed a man who stepped out in front of it. I had several unexplainable things happen while that bus was around. One night, I was at the yard alone. I cleaned the bus at the far end of the yard and walked back to the office to go to the bathroom. I passed the front of every bus on my way and everything was normal. When I went back outside, the windshield wipers on that one bus were moving back and forth at full speed. I checked the cameras and no one entered that bus. The windshield wipers just started going by themselves. Paranormal Hospital Stories, Episode 2. This story is from a nurse in Ontario, Canada. She works at a nursing home that was converted from an old hospital. Her coworker told her about a paranormal experience she had a year ago. The coworker was working one night when she heard a noise coming from the hallway. She looked up in the mirror at the nurse's station and saw a patient wearing an old hospital gown standing in the hallway. The gown wasn't like any they gave the patients currently. The coworker got up to check on the patient, and when she went around the corner, there was no one there. The sender of this story has not experienced anything like that until just a few weeks ago. One night she went to the basement to put her uniform in the laundry. This basement used to be the hospital's morgue. When she entered the tunnel portion of the basement, she heard a voice. It whispered, "Help me, please." The nurse said, "Hello?" and looked around, but she was completely alone. Paranormal Disneyland Stories, Part 4. This is more video surveillance of a possible ghost caught on camera at Disneyland. There's been multiple theories to try to debunk this. Some say it's a trick of the light, and others think it's what happens when a surveillance tape is taped over itself again. Either way, I'll let the video play out, and you let me know what you think. Scary Stories Sent by You. Do not watch this if you are home alone. This is another story from Toronto, Canada, sent by one of my followers. When the sender of this story was young, his school had late starts on Wednesdays. He was in his room when everyone else in his house left for work. He heard noises coming from downstairs and thought a family member had returned home. But things got very strange. Suddenly he heard a huge stomp and the sound of someone running up the stairs. The steps were so loud that it sounded like a bowling ball being dropped on each step. He was so scared he just froze with fear behind the door. He was able to call his aunt who lived across the street. She came over and checked the house, but there was no one else there. Years later, the sender of this story spoke with his mother about the incident. She had also had paranormal encounters at the house, so she called a priest to investigate. They looked around the house, and out in the garden they found the cause of the issue. Someone had buried 3 witch totems to curse their property. Paranormal hospital stories. Nurses on night shift, stay away from this video. This story is from a nurse at a small community hospital in Portland, Oregon. One night, she sat at a computer that faced a dead-end hallway that had 6 patient rooms lining it. It was a slow night, so there were very few patients in those 6 rooms. She was by herself and had the feeling like someone was watching her. She looked up and could see an elderly man standing in the doorway of one of those rooms. She was startled to see him because 1, that room was supposed to be empty, and 2, he wasn't one of her patients on that floor. She looked down for a moment to log off the computer, and when she looked up, he was gone. There was no way he could have walked down that hallway and past her without her seeing him. She got up and checked the room, but he wasn't there. She checked the other rooms and couldn't find him. Finally, she got with the hospital's charge nurse and they did a patient count. No patients were missing that night. Scary first responder stories. This story was sent to me by the daughter of a firefighter in Baltimore, Maryland, who was a battalion chief. On October 17th, 1980, there was a huge fire that spread to multiple buildings. One of those buildings was an abandoned hotel that had been damaged by a fire before. A photographer on scene told the firefighters he saw a woman standing in one of the windows waving for help. It was common to find homeless in abandoned buildings to take shelter from the cold. They sent a rescue team in there, but the floor where the woman was seen had collapsed. They couldn't find any remains or any trace of her, but the photographer had definitely taken a picture and seen the woman there. The battalion chief later investigated and pulled up the file from the original fire. It turns out a woman had died during that first fire in the very room the photographer saw her in. Apparently, that photograph is locked away somewhere on file in Maryland. Paranormal hospital stories. This story comes from a nursing home in Southwest Virginia that is believed to be haunted. If there are any paranormal investigators who are watching this near that area, you might want to check this place out. One worker saw what she describes as a shadow-like figure enter the room of one of the patients. She immediately checked on the patient, but found her deceased. Other workers in the nursing home have also seen this happen just before a patient is about to die. But there's even more paranormal activity happening in this nursing home. At least 20 different residents have refused to stay in one of the rooms. They all described seeing 2 small children watching them. The last incident involves a resident who brought his little black dog to live with him at the facility. After the resident died, the dog died shortly after. Now to this day, many residents complain to staff about seeing a little black dog run through their rooms and keeping them awake at night. Shadow figures, ghost children, and a ghost dog. I'm staying away from that place. Paranormal hospital stories. This story was sent to me by a former security guard at a hospital in Greenville, South Carolina. One night, there was a motion alarm and a computer alarm that went off in the surgical wing. The security guard checked the camera system but didn't see anyone there. The other security guard called him on the radio and told him to meet her by the surgical wing. She said she refused to check it alone. According to her, there had only been 1 employee death at the hospital. It was a surgical tech who used to work in that wing. He had an addiction to general anesthesia and would often sneak to the area and get high while working. One day, after breathing it in, he slipped and fell. He landed headfirst on the ground and suffered brain damage which ultimately killed him. Ever since his death, motion alarms and computer alarms go off at random in the surgical wing. Some nurses claim that they have been grabbed or scratched while walking around in that area. So people who work at that hospital never go in the surgical wing alone at night. This story comes from an EMT in Texas who recently had a paranormal encounter. Due to staffing issues during the pandemic, EMTs in this area helped out the coroner to pick up deceased bodies. A woman on hospice had passed away in her home. The entire family was in the living room, and they directed the EMTs to the bedroom. The EMTs went inside where the body was alone and began placing her in a body bag. They finished and began pushing the gurney outside of the bedroom. One of the EMTs glanced at the bathroom attached to the room. The door was open and the lights were off, but the EMT could clearly see the bathroom mirror. In the reflection of the mirror, The EMT could clearly see a figure standing in the bathroom. It was the same lady they had just placed in the body bag. When she looked further inside the bathroom, there was no one there. There is so much paranormal activity documented at nursing homes. A CNA at a facility in Illinois sent me a story about something that happened to her this month. At about 1:30 a.m., she walked down the hallway when she saw a resident out of his room. He was sitting in a rocking chair in the corner of the hallway. She was confused because this resident needed a walker to get around, and the walker wasn't there. She asked him what he was up to, and he just stared at her. The CNA went to his room to get his walker to take him back. When she walked inside, she found someone in his bed. It was the man she was just talking to in the rocking chair. He had passed away in his bed. When she checked in the rocking chair again, it was empty. Movie theaters are opening back up, so here's a scary story from Daniel, who worked at a theater in Danville, California. At this theater, there were reports of paranormal activity from staff. Daniel hadn't experienced anything like that himself until one night at a showing of Batman vs. Superman. Daniel was in charge of closing for the night. He locked all the doors and checked all the theaters to make sure there was no one left inside. After he finished, he and his manager sat in the theater showing the end of the last movie, where a man and woman were the only customers left. Daniel got up to go to the bathroom. Remember, at this point, there were only 4 people, including him, in the entire building. As he was washing his hands, he heard doors slamming in the woman's restroom across the hall. He described it like the doors were slamming in a domino pattern, one right after the other. He immediately ran out of the men's restroom and didn't see anyone exit the women's restroom door. He knocked on the door and announced himself as a janitor coming in to clean. He didn't get a response back. He went inside and found all 16 bathroom stall doors swaying back and forth after being slammed. He checked every single stall, hoping to at least find a child playing or maybe a teenager pulling a prank on him. But he found nothing. He was the only one in the bathroom. He left just as the couple and his manager were getting out of the movie. I hope you guys like this story. Please like, share, and follow for more. And if you have any stories of your own, send them my way. Nurses witness death quite a bit. This story was shared on a nurses forum online. The nurse worked at an oncology department at a hospital. She was given charge of a patient who was dying and had been unconscious for several days. During the night, the nurse went in the room and she found the patient standing on top of the bed. The patient looked at her and said, "Don't let them take me." The nurse was obviously frightened and asked, "Who's gonna take you?" The patient pointed at the air and said, "That black thing up there." The nurse couldn't see anything. A few minutes later that evening, the patient passed away. If you enjoy these scary stories, like and follow for more, and don't forget to see exclusive stories on my Patreon. A Michigan couple in 2019 caught sight of a possible ghost on their nanny cam. Check out the footage. Something obviously catches the baby's attention. The couple went on to say an unexplainable scratch appeared on their baby after the incident. A group of paranormal investigators went to the house and believe it may be the ghost of the previous resident who died there. What's the scariest movie you've ever seen? A scientific study might have answered the question, which one is the scariest? They tracked the heart rates of 50 people who watched over 100 hours of scary movies. The top 3 films in the study were Sinister, Insidious, and The Conjuring. Do you agree with these top 3? Let me know in the comments if you've seen one scarier. Do you think this paranormal activity caught on camera is real? Let me know in the comments. The house that inspired the Conjuring franchise is on sale right now. The house is located in Harrisville, Rhode Island, and you can take a creepy 3D tour on Zillow. There are so many paranormal stories that come from this house since it was built in colonial times. One of my favorite sightings is about the Crooked Neck Lady. At one point, the house was used as a daycare, and the children who attended reported seeing a woman with her head bent to the side. In the basement is a piece of an old toy chest where children used to draw pictures. If you zoom in on the 3D tour, you can clearly see a child drawing of the Crooked Neck Lady. You know what? If each one of my followers donates $1, I'll go buy the house for paranormal tours. Paranormal hospital stories. A nurse in New Jersey got hired to work at an old nursing home facility. One night she finished up her shift and it was still dark outside. She walked to her car and sat inside. The front of her vehicle faced a garden where the residents of the facility could go on walks. She turned on the car and looked straight ahead. A patient in a gown with silver straight hair was illuminated by the headlights. The patient stared at her for a moment, turned, and walked away. The nurse went back inside the facility and told the staff a patient had gotten out and was in the garden. The staff conducted a patient check and everyone was accounted for. The nurse brushed it off as maybe just being tired and seeing things because she didn't recognize the patient. The next evening, the nurse spoke with her colleagues about what happened. She gave them a description of who she saw. Another nurse went to the patient files and took out a file of a woman who, she remembered, fit the description. The nurse looked at the picture and immediately recognized her as the one who she saw in the garden. The only catch? That patient had died 3 years prior from complications after falling while on a walk in that garden. What happened to the crew of this alleged ghost ship? In 1947, ships traveling the Strait of Malacca heard the following distress call via Morse code. SOS from Orang Medan, we float. All officers, including the captain, dead in chart room, and on the bridge, probably whole of crew dead. A few confused Morse code dashes and dots came through, and then very clearly the words, I die. An American ship called Silver Star answered the distress call and found the Orang Medan. The Silver Star crew members boarded the ship and to their horror found corpses scattered across the deck, with their faces construed in a way like they had just witnessed something ghastly before their death. The Silver Star crew members retreated and attached a line to tow the ghost ship, but just as they secured the line, the ship began to smoke and moments later explode, sending the ship and all of its secrets to the bottom of the sea. Some people believe this woman's ghost helped solve her own murder. In 1977, Teresita Basa, an immigrant from the Philippines, was found brutally murdered. She was buried under a mattress in her home with a knife lodged in her chest. The killer had lit the mattress on fire. Investigators found no physical evidence suggesting who the killer was and had no other leads. However, 6 months after her death, Dr. Jose Chua Jr., one of Basa's co-workers, claimed his wife was having visions about Teresita's murder. Her ghost pointed the finger at Alan Showery, another co-worker of Teresita's. The police were skeptical at first until they saw Teresita's jewelry on Alan's wife. Alan eventually was found guilty and convicted for the crime. Have you heard of the youngest serial killer in U.S. history? His name is Jesse Pomeroy, and he was convicted of murder at the age of 14 in 1874. But he had already been conducting extremely violent behavior for years. You see, Jesse was born with a birth defect with an eye that was covered in a thick white film. His surviving victims would be able to point out this key trait, which eventually led to his arrest. At the age of 5, Jesse's neighbor claimed Jesse had stabbed her cat to death and threw it in the river. In 1871, newspapers in the town of Charleston began to circulate talking about a boy with a marbleized eye assaulting, disfiguring, and torturing other children. He was eventually caught and served only a few months in reform school. Only a few weeks after getting out, he killed 2 other children and was arrested for their murders. He also confessed to the killing of 27 others, but this was never confirmed. Jesse lived the rest of his life in solitary confinement in prison and died in 1929 despite multiple attempts to break out.